This week on the Catholic Vote Radio Hour,
Harvey Weinstein was there and he gave her a standing ovation.
Turns out Harvey Weinstein is a big fan of Hillary Clinton and Planned Parenthood. Katie Yoder of Newsbusters gives us the scoop.
We were praying for the peace in Poland. We were praying so that Europe returns to its Christian roots.
Marcin Jagowski reports from Poland, where over 1 million Catholics prayed a rosary at the nation's borders.
I'm very vocal against the sexualization of children.
Chad Felix Greene advocates for the safety of young boys in the LGBT community.
In the early days of broadcasting, few people realized what a fine art radio was to become.
Hello, you're listening to the Catholic Vote Radio Hour. No Harvey Weinstein money was used in the making of this episode. I'm your host, Stephen Harriott.
Real freedoms are eaten up a little at a time, while government controls are slipped on, while the real power is collected into a few hands. Where government is not limited, no man is free.
Joining me now is Katie Yoder, Associate Culture Editor with the Media Research Center and Newsbusters. What a moral ride in the clouds we've been in this week. Just pure family-friendly news. Is that right, Katie?
Quite the opposite.
Well, of course, what I'm referring to here is Harvey Weinstein, the big scandal around him in Hollywood. But just before the news dropped of Harvey Weinstein, I heard about the allegations against Representative Tim Murphy, looked up to by a lot of pro-lifers, and he's thought of as a reliable pro-life politician. But it came out that he allegedly pressured one of his mistresses to get an abortion, and she came forward and revealed that from texts. So what I'm interested in here is, in the same week, we got the wheat and the tares right next to each other, and Christian right circles, you have this scandal, and then on the left you have this scandal. But what's interesting to me, Katie, is that the left doesn't know what to do with a moral scandal because they've already dispensed with morality.
Right. And you can see this confusion among celebrities and the media and how they're reacting to Weinstein.
Generally, many people in the media industry, they were literally going to parties with Harvey. A lot of people knew. That's the disturbing thing.
Right. A former New York Times reporter said that she had this very story in 2004, and that the Times wouldn't let her publish it. Mm-hmm. And then we recently came out with a story on how the networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS, the past couple years, they were aware of allegations that were out there, but they didn't bring them up while they were interviewing Weinstein. Instead, they would praise him and basically, shone this spotlight on him, applauding him for his work versus looking into these allegations. So this has kind of been swept under the rug for quite a while by many in the media.
So here's the thing that comes to my mind, though. See, I'm a Roman Catholic. I think you're a Roman Catholic as well. For most Roman Catholics, it was a very heart-wrenching experience to discover that, yes, it is in fact true. There was a systematic problem where abusers were moved around from parish to parish and so forth. Very, very faith-shaking and disturbing. But when I look at Hollywood and I look at the expose of Harvey, I don't know, for them, let me give you an example. I don't remember who it was, but some very mainstream, powerful woman tweeted something about the Harvey Weinstein scandal shows that Hollywood is in fact not a progressive town. And I responded, how are satanic egoism and libertinism not progressive? You've made the case for this for decades. What's wrong with lecherousness?
Right.
And they don't have an argument against it.
Right. They've pushed aside conservatives, Catholics, people of faith. And it's also kind of hypocritical, though, because Hollywood does tend to think that they're right in politics, that they have the higher ground. And Harvey Weinstein, he's basically portrayed himself as a proponent for women. He was at a Planned Parenthood gala this year, the 100th Planned Parenthood gala for their big anniversary. And it was honoring Hillary Clinton, and Hillary Clinton, she received the Champion of the Century Award. And The Hollywood Reporter put out that Harvey Weinstein was there, and he gave her a standing ovation. And it's while she's talking about women. So this is what Hillary Clinton says. She says, women in every corner of our country understand that intimately, and anyone who wants to lead should understand that fundamentally this is an issue of morality, protecting access to the full range of reproductive health care.
Abortion, in other words.
Yes. So she's saying that...
And Harvey gives a standing ovation. Oh, my God.
Right,
this is so gross.
Right. And she's talking about, quote, reproductive health care, a.k.a. abortion. And she says, I wish it were common ground, but I know for sure it is a higher ground. And I believe, as you do, that trusting and valuing women is the right and moral position to take. So it's just so ironic right here in this quote. Hillary Clinton is talking about valuing women and this being the moral position, and Harvey Weinstein is there applauding, and yet at the same time, he's trying to portray himself as this moral guy who's standing up for women. At the same time, there are all these allegations about how he's mistreated women. 3 women are alleging that he raped them. So this is a really serious problem of hypocrisy right now.
Yeah. For me, hypocrisy is a tired word because hypocrisy isn't in itself a problem. If you have right morality and you fall short of it and that makes you a hypocrite, I can work with you. But when you have no morality in the first place, I don't know what to do with you. The whole town in Hollywood and the whole town of D.C., at least on the DNC side, doesn't have any standards. In fact, just weeks ago, they made clear that the objectification and use of women as sex objects is praiseworthy in Hugh Hefner. So if that's what they're doing, then how can they turn around and rebuke someone like Weinstein? I don't know. See, with Murphy, the pro-life movement can just say, well, if it's true what Murphy did, pressured his mistress to get an abortion, well, he proves the point that we've been making all along, that things like abortion are tactics for cowardly and feckless men to use against women that they see as sex toys. That's what we've argued the whole time. And if he falls short of our moral principles, he only discredits himself, not our moral principles.
Right. I mean, I would say, they're criticizing him, Weinstein, but, one big difference that I'm seeing in the media is that, and you touched on this a little bit, but I feel like the media are trying to completely discredit the pro-life movement through Tim Murphy, whereas when they are talking about Weinstein, they're not trying to completely discredit or say, hey, there's something wrong with the entertainment industry, that there's a bigger picture that we need to look into. Instead, they're just focusing on him.
Right. In other words, Tim Murphy is the pro-life movement and the entire GOP. Harvey Weinstein is, I don't know, white men. In other words, to further the Marxist dialectic of class warfare. That's all they do. So, Katie, do you think, Katie, that there's pervasive darkness in Hollywood and that occasionally they just trot out a Weinstein and sacrifice him just to say, hey, everyone, there was a problem, but we took care of it. This guy was the problem. But in fact, the problem goes on. Do you think that that's possible? I get nervous about that.
Right. I mean, I think that, this could be something where it's just the tip of the iceberg.
Right.
The entertainment industry does put out an awful lot of content where women are victims of violence and it's glorified. But I think there's a lot of hope too, because, we consume the entertainment industry, but we consume it critically. And I think it's so important that we teach Americans and inform them, Catholics especially, inform them about what's right and what's wrong, and to call out the entertainment industry when they're incorrect, and to praise good media and encourage that, and to even fund good media.
Yeah. So
I think just because we're surrounded by this culture doesn't mean that we have to conform to it.
Yeah.
And I think we can rise above it and hopefully educate others to rise above it again too.
Amen.
So I'm holding out on that hope, one day.
Well, and also one last thing is journalists. If you have a conscience, go after these people. If you don't, I will. I'll go undercover, go to Hollywood, because it needs to happen. There need to be exposés about sexual abuse in Hollywood. It's going on pervasively. There already have been some exposés. There's a superb video. You can watch the whole thing on YouTube called An Open Secret. And it's about these heroic boys in the child star industry who were abused and exposed their own abusers. They are such heroes. I was so amazed by them. They were abused by a homosexual predator who was their agent, and they ended up basically recording the guy. You know, these are 12-year-old boys. Yeah. It was so cool to see them fight back like that. And that needs. We're leaving it up to the victims, you people. You're journalists, so show some courage.
Right. So we need to encourage journalists to expose these stories, to put them out there, to inform the American public what's going on. And starting out with Weinstein, you know, it's good that the media are putting this out there, that they are covering this, even though it's rather imperfect how they're doing it.
Amen. Yep. All right. Well, thank you very much for being with us again. Katie Yoder of the Media Research Center and Newsbusters. You can find her online, and I encourage listeners to find her online at K_Yoder on Twitter. And you can also, again, follow her columns. She's a great columnist. So thanks again for being with us, Katie. And I can't wait to talk to you again in about a month.
Great. Thank you for having me.
I'm not gonna get home.
Joining me now on a little bit of a fuzzy line from Poland is Marcin Jagowski. He's a PhD student and also a Catholic who was involved in the recent, much written about, much talked about rosary that was prayed all along the borders of Poland and also in parishes throughout the nation of Poland. And it was a rosary that was meant to have a sort of salubrious effect, I think, on the West, on Europe, or to bring it back to its roots, to bring it back to Christianity. Is that a fair way of characterizing it, Marcin?
Yeah, of course. So first of all, the idea of this massive event of praying rosary across Poland was born a couple of time ago, and at the beginning, many of us thought it won't have a very big participation. We are pretty surprised of the number of people who did participate. It said it was more than 1 million people.
My gosh, that's amazing. I've been to Poland, by the way, just briefly, and I did like the fact that when I walked by parishes, the lines for confession were just as long as the lines for communion.
Oh, yeah.
Which is a good sign. It means they're sinning a lot, but it also means that they're taking forgiveness seriously.
Yeah, we are still a very traditionally Catholic nation, and praying rosary or participation in other Catholic services in Poland is still a common thing.
Right. Now, but in the context, let's put this in historical context. First of all, the day that this massive rosary took place was the feast day of Our Lady of the Rosary, which commemorates the use of the rosary or the praying of the rosary by Catholic warriors who ousted Muslims at the Battle of Lepanto. So that's kind of, in the first place, part of what I think led to, the mainstream media controversy, because it had this connotation that had to do with, kicking Muslim butt in the 1500s. Mm-hmm. And then we're also in the context where there's this massive debate over mass, mostly Muslim migration into Europe, and Poland is probably better about securing its borders than any other European country. So what did you think of the backlash of all of this in the mainstream media?
Okay, it's definitely impossible to forget about the background of this event at the Battle of Lepanto and its anniversary in October each year. But it was not the main goal. We were praying for the peace in Poland and the peace in Europe, and so that Europe returns to its Christian roots. Of course, it's related to what's happening right now in Europe and in Poland.
Yeah.
As to Poland, we didn't accept the compulsory quotas from the European Union.
Yeah. Just a little background. The European Union is keen to, with compulsory quotas, force member states to accept certain numbers of migrants in keeping with Mrs. Merkel's generally very come one, come all policy. And Poland is one of the few that has boldly bucked that and said, no, we have a right as our own nation to define our own migration policies.
Yes, Poland, as other Central European nations, were not very enthusiastic to these ideas. And it's not because we are not very open when it comes to immigrants. We have more than 1 million official immigrants from Ukraine and other Eastern countries. We have a big Vietnamese community in Warsaw. But the fact that we didn't accept the idea of taking the compulsory quota from the West was mostly due to the fact that we want to maintain our independence and we want to decide who we are accepting in and who we are not. And in this case, we couldn't have any impact on the decision who is coming to Poland and who is not. And the other thing is that those people who are coming to Europe from Middle East and Northern Africa, they are definitely not wanted to stay in Poland. They would prefer to be in Western European countries, which are more generous when it comes to social programs.
Right. It's funny to me, though. This is what gets me. Is that we're talking about a historical context when we have an internationally recognized genocide that specifically targets Christians as well as Yazidis and ethnic minorities in the Middle East. But Christians have been a main target of an internationally recognized genocide by Islamists in Middle Eastern countries, which are overwhelmingly dominated by radical fundamentalist Muslim governments and ideologies. So that's a context that it's sad to me that it's controversial to acknowledge that, and that a Christian country like Poland would be shamed in the first place for saying, well, we want to be, to take this carefully, right? Mm-hmm. Because we're sensitive to victims of a genocide.
Well, the question is probably the political correctness, which doesn't allow us to differentiate people in terms of religion or ethnicity.
Right.
So we all know that a certain number of Christians who came to Germany as refugees were forced to live together in one place with Muslims, which create difficult situation for them.
Right. The thing about this political correctness, as you call it, is that it's cruel. What is progressive or generous or kind about not distinguishing between targeted and non-targeted people during the course of a genocide?
Oh, yeah.
And especially if it's imposed. Poland gets a lot of bad press, by the way. I've been listening to my local NPR, Wisconsin Public Radio. Like NPR, it plays BBC in the later evenings. And when I listen to it, my gosh, is Poland a punching bag?
Yeah, we are. The fact that we chose a different government recently, who is less, let's say, liberal in certain terms. This was not a very good news for certain countries in the Western Europe and certain organizations there. We are getting used to it, but it's not very often. It's not just.
Right. Well, it reminds me a little bit. One parallel that I'm kind of tempted to draw is press coverage of the Trump administration has been similarly harsh. But perhaps an even more appropriate comparison would be that Poland seems to be treated in the mainstream media in a way that reminds me of the way that certain African countries are treated. Their leadership will similarly stand up for family values versus LGBT ideology. And they get a similar sort of bad rap from the EU and from the UN and so forth.
So despite the fact that we are officially not recognized as a developed country since a couple of weeks officially, we still experience the kind of paternalism from the Western countries, especially from Germany. It's getting obvious that these big European economies are trying to impose their solutions on the smaller countries.
It's funny to me is that there's a lot of talk, both in the U.S. and in Europe, about the Nazi regime. And what's hilarious is that people in Europe seem to be saying Donald Trump, the new president in the U.S., is a Nazi. The Polish leadership are Nazis. And that we're not the Nazis because we're the ones who believe that Germany should be able to invade Poland and impose their political ideology on countries like Poland.
Exactly.
It's bizarre to me how parallel, how ironic it is that they don't see that they are the ones, the browbeaters. They're the ones that are sort of the powerful ones who are oppressive, right?
It's also in line in historical politics of Germany recently. We were talking about the political correctness, and according to the political correctness right now, it's almost impossible to say that Germany invaded Poland in 1939. We are supposed to say that Poland was invaded by the Nazis.
Wow. I didn't know that. So you're not meant to say that Germany invaded Poland, but rather that Nazi did.
I mean, this is what we hear. This is what is happening, especially in the Western medias. Right now, we have a big media campaign against the false statements made by certain Western medias, saying that the concentration camps on the Polish territory occupied by Nazi Germany were Polish. So sometimes even often, we hear the notion Polish death camps, which is completely false, untrue, because the camps were German, were Nazi German.
Of course.
And the only thing which was Polish was the soil, the ground, and the territory which was taken by the other state.
My gosh, that's very dangerous historical revisionism. Well, what we should do, Marcin, what I want to do is I want you and I to adopt each other, because we need to. Catholics in America, I think, and Catholics in Poland really are spiritual brothers in arms, and I think that there could be real value in us being in touch, and for Catholics in the U.S. to realize that Poland, goodness sake, it produced one of the greatest popes in modern times. We have so much. We owe you so much. Also, a lot came from Poland in terms of the rhetoric and the policy and the political efforts to eventually discredit and then topple communism.
Of course, I think that we should cooperate. There are things that we can teach you, but there are also many things that you can teach us.
Amen. All right. Well, thank you very much for being with me. Let me try your name again. Is it Marcin Jagowski?
Yeah, that's a good pronunciation. Thank you for having invited me. It was a pleasure.
All right. It was our pleasure as well. Thank you. Well, we've come to that part of the show where we have our weekly political discussion with Catholic Vote Political Director Joshua Mercer. Today we're going to be talking about censorship, or the suppression of diversity of thought, and we have a particularly egregious example this week, but it's a story that we've seen all too many times before. Isn't that right, Josh?
Well, yeah, actually, what happened here is a pro-life congresswoman by the name of Marsha Blackburn came out with an announcement video. She's going to run for United States Senate in Tennessee, and she was talking about how when she was in the House investigating Planned Parenthood and making sure that they no longer sell baby body parts. What happened? Well, Twitter said no way, no how. They refused to let her advertise her campaign commercial on Twitter, saying it was inflammatory. As Matt Walsh said, Twitter doesn't have a problem with Planned Parenthood selling baby body parts. They have a problem with Marsha Blackburn complaining about selling of baby body parts. That just strikes me as insane.
It reminds me also, Marjorie Dannenfelser over at the Susan B. Anthony list. A little while back, she put out some advertisements, and Twitter shut her advertisements down. And actually, particularly what she did is she tweeted a picture of Mother Teresa saying that killing babies was a bad thing, basically, and it got shut down by Twitter. She contacted Twitter and said, why? And they said, well, it violates some policy about selling medical services.
Right. This is not the first time, as you mentioned. It also happened with Live Action, another pro-life group. And so What we're finding out here right now is that the digital landscape, we all just assume the internet is this great place where it doesn't matter how little money you have in your pocket, everyone has a voice on the internet, and we all have the ability to speak. Now, we're not talking about government censorship, of course, which is what they have like in China or Iran. So I want to be clear about that. This is a private business. It's Twitter's website. If this is what Twitter wants to do, that's fine. But here's the thing. Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Google, Apple, all these big companies, they try to pretend like they're viewpoint neutral. But in fact, they are most definitely not viewpoint neutral. There's a candidate running for the Senate in Missouri. His name is Austin Peterson. Mm-hmm. I happen to like a different candidate, but he's a straight shooter. In fact, he showed a photo of a legal firearm, an AK-47, and he posted it on his Facebook page because there's a lot of discussion, obviously, about gun control. And there's a lot of misinformation out there. And he was just trying to say, this is a legal firearm. This is not against the law in any way. Well, Facebook took down the photo. They thought that was unseemly somehow, having a photo of a legal firearm. And so, and again, we see with Google, it tries to pretend, Google, don't do any harm. Let's help facilitate conversations, connections with different people. And then they had an employee that said, well, look, it seems like the hiring practices and the internal staffing here at Google is not based on this sort of free exchange of ideas. It's based on political correctness and all this other stuff. And that guy, James Damore, got fired from Google because he dared speak against the liberal orthodoxy or whatever.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to pretend this James guy is somehow some conservative or pro-life voice or whatever. What I'm saying is that in Silicon Valley, with these big internet titans, there is a liberal orthodoxy. And if you cross it, they seemingly have no problem shoving you into the digital corner. And it really points to the need of making sure you can create your own sphere, your own space, your own communities digitally so that you can communicate with people. That's one of the things we try to do with Catholic Vote. Come to our website, see what kind of stuff we're talking about, subscribe to this podcast, get our Catholic Vote loop emails, whatever the case may be. You don't want to rely on Facebook to be your filter, to be your glasses on how you see the entire world. And so it really is important to make sure that you just don't rely on Google, Facebook, Apple, Twitter, whatever, to be your only means of getting communication. That's why we think it's very important. Facebook's not going to make sure, well, you know what? Feminists are completely lying about the HHS contraceptive mandate. Let's make sure people get the truth because, the internet's about the no, come on. I mean, Facebook's a business. They look at you as data and they just want whatever can sell them more bars of shampoo. That's what they're about.
You mentioned earlier the idea of having alternative platforms. What do you think the future is for people who just want to have a reasonable communities where they can have these discussions?
Well, first of all, one of the most successful things over the last 2 years was when Facebook decided they were going to filter out fake news. And what they ended up doing is just curtailing any conservative media news that were being circulated, not just the stuff that was objectively like fake stuff, because there was stuff that was fake. And so Facebook's like, oh, well, we'll do this great public service and we'll cut out all this websites that we don't think are verified or trustworthy. Well, they cut out a lot of stuff that was really good, objective, and just like opinionated websites or stuff. And so what happened is enough conservatives complained. A lot of conservatives around the country, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, complain about this and we're saying, we're going to leave this platform if you're going to say that the only news that can be shared is from left-wing websites. And so by standing up and saying, we're going to leave, because right now we see you as being sort of viewpoint neutral. If you're going to shift over and basically make this a liberal website only, then we're out of here. We're going to find another means to connect with other people. And that was important. And Facebook got the message real quick. And they, whoa, no. And Zuckerberg realizing he would lose tens of millions of dollars. See, money is important.
Money is important.
Yes. He changed his tune real quick and said, no. Conservatives, Republicans, we're all welcome here.
Speaking of money, I mean, there's a lot of money that affects culture. And right now, most of our contributors and columnists at Catholic Vote Now, and most of my guests here on this show, are from these really impressive media efforts. Conservative Review TV, Media Research Center, Newsbusters, Daily Wire. These things are exploding. Recently, the Daily Wire was, I think, the top visited conservative site in the country, and it's really new. Breitbart is another example, to some degree, of these growing alternative media people. And I know, like Michelle Malkin over at Conservative Review, she is, I think, right in presenting this as she says, this is the new thing.
It's popular now to be very critical of the media, and I think that's great. I feel like 20 years ago, I'm raising my hand, like the media is absolutely slanted and biased. Why are we trying to pretend like it isn't? And I kept saying, I would meet with pro-lifers and conservatives at college campuses all across the country 15 years ago, and I'd be like, stop complaining about the media. You need to be the media.
Amen, yes.
Start your own media company or your own media force, whether it's a blog, a print out a newspaper, whatever. You need to get out there and you need to communicate. Why are we waiting in line for crumbs from the New York Times table? Bury them by getting everyone to read your stuff instead.
Yeah, and that did happen to a huge degree, especially in 2016. A lot of it accelerated. I'm so excited about this wave of new media that I'm seeing. And one of the good effects of it, Josh, even establishment mainstream media outlets are better as a result because they see the competition. Weekly Standard column that was really great, The Human Stain was the header, was about Weinstein. And they said this article at Weinstein at the New York Times never would have been written were it not for the fact that the journalism world is collapsing. because there was so much money sustaining this systematic cover-up culture. Weinstein was looked up to. You had to cow to Weinstein if you were in the journalism industry because, he invited your boss to parties, and his money he was a major advertiser on the New York Times website.
Well, that's actually one of the points that came to light in the last few days is that the New York Times actually had this story back in 2004, and they decided not to run with it because they were so worried about the advertising revenue that they get from Miramax and all that stuff that, Weinstein's properties, right? We have seen as Catholics in our own church precisely the problem with, because a lot of these actors and actresses now say, oh yeah, I've long known that guy was a total creep and he did these kind of things. And then people would say, well, why didn't you say something? You have to step forward and say something. It's funny because people in society have said, how could the Catholic Church let this stuff happen for so long? It's because abuse happens when there's a lot of power and a lot of shame, and you need to be able to break through it.
Yeah. In a way, Hollywood is a church, and it has more members than the Catholic Church does because it has members in every home. Families gather together around the altar of the TV or the computer screen, and they worship.
Right.
in a meaningful way. That is a trap that we can fall into. And everyone in the country is a member. Everyone knows who Walt Disney is. Everyone knows who Jessica Chastain is and Russell Crowe is and Matt Damon is. And we all look up to them almost as though they are our spiritual leaders and our priests. And we're discovering now that whole church hierarchy is worthy of severe scrutiny, and possibly we should even all become apostates from Hollywood and find our old religion, return to the real God.
Well, it was a theater critic in the 1930s who said theaters are the new church of the masses, where people sit huddled in the dark, listening to people in the light tell them what it is to be human.
Wow. Well, on that light note, let's go back to church. And this has, again, been our weekly political discussion with Josh Mercer. And Josh, how can we stay in the loop about news like this?
Well, subscribe to our free daily email newsletter. It only takes about 3 to 5 minutes to read. Go to catholicvote.org/loop to get the loop.
All right. Thanks so much, Josh. Talk to you next week.
All right. Thanks, Steve.
I'm joined now by Chad Felix Greene, a brilliant commentator whose work I discovered just a little while back when I read his brilliant essay in Huffington Post about adult men who prey on young boys in the LGBT community. By the way, this is my good faith effort as an Orthodox Catholic to build a bridge to the LGBT community by talking with Chad. But your work, a lot of it focuses on endangered young men, and I commend you for it. It's very courageous work. And everybody hates you. I've noticed, actually. Well, you get into a lot of Twitter battles, which I follow, and it seems to me that the people get the most angry at you are themselves LGBT activists rather than what one would expect, which is, say, conservative Christians. Isn't that right?
Oh, yeah. Everybody on the right is wonderful to me. Conservative Christians are my best friends. But
really?
The LGBT... Oh, yeah. I've been on Twitter for probably 7 years or so, and the vast majority of the people that follow me, that I interact with daily, are very conservative people, and a great deal of them are conservative Christians, the people that I'm supposed to be the most afraid of.
Wow.
The only people that ever attack me personally on any particular issue at all are people on the left, typically LGBT activists.
Wow. So you are stigmatized by the people who are supposed to be your advocates, and you are advocated for by those whom I'm supposed to believe hate you.
Exactly.
Well, maybe I should hate you just to even the playing field. I mean, I'm ruining the narrative here. So go ahead.
The reason is because I don't hold to the collective narrative of victimhood, or that we need to march in the streets to protest the average person. I live in a very rural area. I'm surrounded by Christians. I'm the only Jew wearing a yarmulke in probably 100 miles. And I've been openly gay since I was 16. And my life is just average, just like everybody else's. And the story, the narrative that the LGBT world constantly puts out there just isn't true. If it were true, I would be advocating against it, but it's not true. And that's all I care about. And for some reason, that's extremely threatening.
Wow. So what are the things that you say that you think they take issue with the most?
I would say the two biggest areas are the fact that I constantly praise our culture for its inclusive nature, our legal equality, and that an individual shouldn't live their entire life imagining themselves as a victim. The second is that I'm very vocal against the sexualization of children. and that I'm very protective of the innocence that you have as a child to a teenager. And I think that everything from just sexuality to transgenderism, etc., is something in the adult world, something that adults can decide for themselves, but shouldn't be imposed onto children.
Wait, so NAMBLA alert, you're saying that when you talk about dangers to children, that gets a defensive reaction out of the LGBT community?
Every time.
Why?
And because they imagine that I'm stigmatizing. They imagine that I'm promoting negative ideas of what being gay is as a whole. And they think if they were to agree that a movie or a book or a particular actor or something was doing something inappropriate in terms of portraying an adult-teen relationship or sexualizing a 12-year-old boy in drag or anything, if they spoke out against it, that the imaginary oppressive enemy would use it against every gay person. So in their world, the whole is more important than the individual. They seem to be willing to allow a 40% homeless teen rate for gays as long as they can continue making money off of it in terms of a narrative.
Now, when they're protecting that narrative, you say the whole is more important than the individual. What effect does that narrative protection have on individuals, say, young boys in the LGBT community?
Well, if you look at the statistics, 20 to 22% of new HIV infections are boys and men aged 13 to 24.
My gosh.
So the question I ask is, who do you think is giving these young men HIV? Do you think it's other 13 or 14-year-old boys?
Where do they get it? Yeah, it has to come from somewhere.
Right. The LGBT world often cites a 40% homeless rate for LGBT teens. Somewhere upwards of 50% of transgender teenagers, especially in the Black and Latino community, have reported engaging in sex work. The top transgender advocate right now, her name is Janet Mock. She led the Women's March this past year, talks about her experience going into sex work at age 15 with glowing remembrance. She talks about the adult men that taught her how to be a prostitute as these beautiful, brave women who showed her who she really was. So because sexuality is so important, and because children validate everything that they want the public to believe, the left, for some reason, for a while, has been obsessed with children having adult sexuality.
Whoa.
I talk about it as an inverse autonomy, where we believe 5-year-olds can choose their gender, but 25-year-olds can't take care of themselves financially or get health care. And because of this, the idea that a child to a teenager is sexually autonomous, that they are confident in themselves, that they're not afraid, that they're educated, and that they're active, is a win for progress.
Well, it seems to me that it would be a win for predators, no?
Right.
Oh, you have a cat.
I do have a cat. He's very confused as to who I'm talking to.
Well, from a cat's perspective, when we do this, we're just talking at a wall.
Right.
And that must be pretty confusing for a cat.
Yeah.
What's your cat's name?
His name is Freddie.
As in Freddie Mercury?
Freddie's in green. It was my grandfather's name.
All right, so this is the spirit of the late Mr. Green.
Yep.
Now, can I ask, does your cat typically agree with your political views?
I think so. I think he's more of a libertarian, though.
Now, do you guess that from cats in general, or is your cat in particular?
Oh, most cats don't like rules. They don't like the oppressive governing body that controls them daily.
Right. So all we need to do is we need cat suffrage. Cat suffrage will give us limited government, right?
Yes. Yeah. That and low taxes.
Right. Okay. So tell me if I'm off base here. I don't know if you know this, but there's been an increasing push, even in the Catholic Church, to sort of embrace and normalize the gay lifestyle and even gay sex acts, perhaps, which is totally contradictory to our teachings, of course, as Catholics. But here's what worries me. One of the main mantras being employed is born this way, you know? And I'm afraid if you apply that to LGBT, trans, inevitably what you're inviting is teachers at schools discussing with children sex acts and their own genitalia. And that scares me. That worries me because it's normalizing strangers talking to children behind closed doors, talking to our children about these things. Doesn't that sound, isn't that dangerous?
I completely agree with you, because when I was a child, it was in the 80s, and we had the child abductor scare all the time. And so we went through a great deal. When I was a very young child, we went through a great deal of school training to avoid strangers and to avoid, if anybody touched you, you're supposed to scream, you're supposed to go find an adult. That kind of thing.
Recall stranger danger, remember?
Yeah. And it's strange now because, again, with the obsession of validating a narrative, they're looking to children and saying, transgender adults complain that if they had just been allowed to be themselves in the gender they chose as a child, their life would have been better. So we need to find all the children who are trans and make sure that they can have the life that they need.
Right.
So from their perspective, it's altruistic. It's a way to protect those children. In reality, it's, as you were saying, normalizing the discussion of sex, normalizing the objectification of a body. So a child feels that their body is something that is outside of themselves rather than something they need to protect. And it opens the door for predators to access children because the consequence of this is that parents are not going to be open to their children transitioning. And the LGBT push is that the parents shouldn't be involved. Just like when I was a kid and people started to come out, it was a controversy if a teenager in 1998 came out as gay if the school would tell his parents. The LGBT world views that as child abuse because it's putting the child up for danger because they are unsafe at home.
So the assumption this is all based on is that parents and natural families are more of a danger to kids than strangers talking to kids about sex acts. What is this? This is bizarre. Where does it come from?
It's a progressive idea that authority is the primary decider and that parents are in the way of the state education. We can see this in so many different things when everyone talks about it takes a village. When people say they're not your children. I think Melissa Perry from MSNBC a few years ago said that. She said that children were not owned by their parents. They belonged to the community.
Right.
It's a progressive idea that children go to school to be taught a universal truth in spite of their parents, especially religious parents. Religious parents are viewed as a direct threat to the happiness and the well-being of a normal, universal child.
My gosh. Well, okay, so Chad, you have a life story that flies in the face of this narrative. And I know it's dark and it's very personal, but would you mind sharing a little bit of that with us right now? Because I think you've done great work with it. I think you're using it to shine a light, and I really admire that. So if you wouldn't mind, please share.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I grew up in, as the internet was becoming very popular, I had a home computer just for myself and an AOL account and a Yahoo account when I was 14. And I also grew up when we started becoming a lot more independent in those ways in terms of sexuality. I watched all the movies, I got all the magazines, I had lots of books to look at, and I started to internalize this idea that I was a gay person. But my first experiences with older men happened by accident. My dad worked at a college campus, and I would go to that campus in the evenings or during the summer, and I would go to the library and just hang out and read books all day. And most college libraries have a well-known place where gay men can anonymously have sex. And in that case, it was the basement bathroom. And the basement happened to be where the literary books were, and that's what I was interested in. And so one day I went to the bathroom. An older man, probably in his 50s or so, followed me back out and then started following me all around until he cornered me into a place where we were isolated, and he physically started to touch me. He grabbed my crotch, and to my surprise, he started to initiate sex, and I didn't do anything. I didn't know what to do. I was actually afraid I was going to get in trouble because he was an adult.
Oh my gosh.
And after the experience, he left, and I was just stunned. I was convinced that my dad knew. I was convinced that everybody knew, and I was embarrassed. I was ashamed that I had done something wrong. But it also triggered a little curiosity of men engage in this here. And that was interesting to me because that's what I'd read about. That's what I'd seen online. So I went back. And although I didn't like him, I thought, well, maybe there are other men. And then I ended up meeting a guy who was in his early 20s who I fell madly in love with and was convinced he was going to be my boyfriend. And I met him once, of course. And
wait, just to be clear, how old were you when this all started?
I was 14.
Oh my gosh.
And so I'm doing this entirely without my father knowing. I mean, this is all happening outside of him because of this idea that I had to keep it secret from my family, because my father would reject me. My father would kick me out. That's what we always read about.
Well, what did your father think? I mean, did he know what was going on?
He sort of got an idea when I was 15 or so, because I had been looking at gay porn sites on his computer.
Oh, wow.
And his work administration had noticed and asked him about it, and they determined that it was something else. But so he had asked me at some point and was...
Wait, that's such a rookie move, Chad.
Oh, I know. It's looking back, it's all happened largely in my head. I didn't talk to anybody about it. I felt completely isolated, and every resource that I read told me that I was entering a world that hated me, that it was dangerous, and that my family was going to reject me. And all the movies I watched were these coming-of-age stories or these romances about gay men meeting in dark alleys or in basements or at gay bars and having anonymous sex and then falling in love with one another. I just sort of assumed that that's what being gay was like.
So
and as
you're telling me that as a 14-year-old boy, the media narrative about homosexuality taught you that the fact that you had just been molested was not so much a bad thing, and that the worst thing you could do is talk to your parents.
Exactly.
You poor child. I mean, that's horrific.
And honestly, that's the reason why I talk about it. I talk about that guy that I fell in love with, after meeting, this was probably, he must have been 22 or 23. He met a 14-year-old and he engaged in sex with that person and then left. But in my mind, it was so much larger. It was this huge emotional thing. I was in love for months. And I went back night after night looking for him again. And in the process was exposed to a great deal of other men who could physically tell that I was a young teenager who still had sex with me.
My God.
And the reason I talk about it is because I still see a lot of media, a lot of LGBT media that pushes the idea that families reject children. That's why there are so many homeless LGBT. That's why LGBT commit suicide. It's why there's so much depression and drug use and so forth. And it makes me imagine that right now there are 14-year-old boys who have these same thoughts, these same curiosities, with 20 years more experience in the media normalizing it, that are afraid to tell their parents because they're convinced they're going to be kicked out of their house or they're going to be beaten up or any other number of things that just isn't true. And now I can't imagine why I didn't tell somebody. But at the time, I think outside of being embarrassed and ashamed, I also thought, well, I'm a gay person and this is what we do. I'm a gay man and we have sex in basements.
My gosh.
That's all I'd ever seen.
So, again, this just sounds dangerous to me. And I mentioned to you earlier that there has been a kind of a pro-LGBT push going on in Roman Catholic circles, even from high echelons. And I'd like your perspective on that. First of all, why do you think is there all of a sudden so much talk of the LGBT community in the church?
I feel like progressivism has taken a lot of influence in the Catholic Church, and progressivism is all about optics. It's all about what you look like, what the narrative is. And so I feel like the Catholic Church is trying very hard to win sort of a popularity contest. They're trying to be described as LGBT inclusive and as proponents of equality and have rainbow stickers on everything so that they can proudly show that they are the good guys, which is, in our modern culture, that's what you do when you're trying to prove that you are a good guy.
Wow.
And, I'm not Catholic, but I feel like I've heard a great deal about a reduction in people attending services, that funding is becoming more complicated, which is true about just about every religion. And they've been trying to find that sort of Whoopi Goldberg moment of how do we get people interested? How do we bring people back to the church? And I think that they've decided that the best way is to appeal to the progressive left.
Wow, that is a great analysis. What I'm thinking right now is I just can't believe we're doing this. Right now we're living still in the wake of a massive, horrible sex abuse scandal in the Roman Catholic Church. And now, by the way, at the beginning of that scandal, we at least had some concern about the safety of young boys. And let me go back to a report. In 2004, the John Jay College of Criminal Justice released a study on the sex abuse crisis in the Roman Catholic Church. And the Boston Globe, these are the heroes who exposed the crisis, reported at it at the time. And I'm going to quote from an article from the Boston Globe in 2004. Of the 10,667 reported victims, 81% were male, the report said, and more than 3/4 of the victims were post-pubescents, meaning the abuse did not meet the clinical definition of pedophilia. Instead, most fell victim to ephebophiles, men who are sexually attracted to adolescent or post-pubescent children. That's all a quote. But I mean, by the way, I want to emphasize they are children. But to go on, Karen Terry, the principal investigator for the team of academics from the John Jay College of Criminal Justice that carried out the research in the other quantitative report, said the average age of the victims was 12.6 years, but the most common category of victims was a boy between 11 and 14. But according to the Boston Globe, the head of the review board warned that an understanding of the crisis is not possible without reference to two factors: priestly celibacy and homosexuality. So I'm putting that information side by side with your work, and you're kind of calling out the LGBT community, which is, as you say, dangerous for children. And then I'm looking at the danger for children in the church, and I just can't believe what we're doing. Why would we be trying to ingratiate ourselves to that world right after our own sex abuse scandal?
Exactly, and it's sort of ironic because there was a TV show in America called Queer as Folk that was very popular for a long time. And two of its main storylines. The first was a 17-year-old who was in high school who met a 29-year-old at a gay bar, his first time going. They had sex together. And then the 17-year-old fell in love and then ended up leaving his own home and moving in with the 29-year-old. And they ended up having a long-term successful relationship. And the second storyline was two establishment characters, two gay male characters. They lived in Philadelphia in the gay area, and there was a episode where teenage prostitutes are out at night, and they were near their house. I guess wherever they were was near a corner. And they were complaining about the night after night noise. They couldn't go to sleep because the boys out there yelling all the time. And one of those young men, who was, I think, 15 maybe, ends up moving in with them, and they adopt him and they try to give him a normal life. But the assumption was, here are adult men who are aware of teenage boys as sex workers outside their window, and they're acting as though it's a neighbor's dog.
Wow.
And their best friend has a 17-year-old living with them, and he's almost 30.
Right.
And this was all done in a very celebratory way.
And you would say that's dangerous.
Oh, yes, absolutely. People often ask me what the difference is between a 17 and an 18-year-old. And really, the difference is that an 18-year-old has legal autonomy and can make decisions for themselves, and they have the responsibility of their decisions. A 17-year-old doesn't. I still don't think an adult should prey on the instability of a young mind that is controlled by hormones that they don't understand yet. Obviously, when I was 14, 15, 16, 17, I don't know, but I know that I've had at least 300 sexual partners in my adult life. The majority of that happened before I was 25.
Right. That doesn't sound pleasant, frankly. I mean, it doesn't sound like it's all it's cracked up to be.
No, it's a continual searching for something deeper than what you can find physically. But you assume that the physical part of it is adult and grown up and meaningful and edgy and fun. And when I was in my teens, I almost nightly would go online trying to find partners. And I mean, there were times when it would be 1 o'clock in the morning and I would be waiting outside in February in a parking lot for a red car to come by. And this was before we all had webcams, and I had no idea what they looked like, and they didn't know what I looked like. And I would get in the car with a stranger to go have sex, and then they would bring me back and I would go back home.
How old would he be usually?
Anywhere between 20s to 50s. Looking back at that, I'm surprised I wasn't killed, but I obviously wasn't capable of making rational decisions. Every single time I did it, I thought I was making a good, well-reasoned adult decision that I felt, was I entitled to. But obviously I couldn't.
And you were wrong.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it would have been good if somebody had said you were wrong, right?
If just one of those men, if you imagine just one of those men had said, "What are you doing? Do you realize how dangerous this is? I know that you are in high school. I know that you are afraid to talk about your sexuality with your family, but why are you doing this?" It would have changed everything. But no. Every single person that I ever had sex with, it just was an anonymous sexual experience. And I was just lucky that none of them happened to be serial killers.
Wow. Okay, now, I know this is very dark and very personal, but you were also a victim of a later sexual assault.
In my mid-20s, I was raped, and that's how I became HIV positive.
Now, this was a tryst. right, that you had arranged online, right?
Yes, and I was going to pick him up from his hotel he was visiting, and we were going to go to dinner and go to a movie, and I thought it was a date. But when I arrived, he overpowered me, and he was HIV positive, and he was trying to intentionally infect me. It was the reason that he had set up the whole thing.
He was intentionally infecting you with HIV?
Yes, and that's
Why?
It's fairly common. I've talked with this with Stephen Crowder before. There's a subculture in the gay world where there are bug chasers, gay men who seek out HIV-positive partners to have risky sex with, trying to get the virus. And then there are people who have the virus that see it as this strange vampire spreading of their virus kind of thing. There are people that try to infect as many people as they can. It's why we have HIV disclosure laws, is because those people exist.
Just out of malignance, or why?
Out of malignance, out of resentment, out of strange fetishizing of the virus. And today it's often expressed in the desire to prevent stigma around it. LGBT activists like to argue that if you're HIV positive, you have no moral or ethical or legal obligation to say so, that it is the partner's job to protect themselves. And so there's a great deal of danger involved in all of it. And all of this circles back to exposing teenagers.
You know what I was thinking to myself is what you have suffered in the LGBT community is what we would normally categorize as a series of specifically anti-gay hate crimes.
Mm-hmm.
And you're saying that you find that to be pervasive in the LGBT community and you don't find it outside of it.
Correct. And the reality is that I was never in the bar scene. I never did drugs. I never drank. I'm 35. I've never been drunk. I've always been a fairly boring person from a gay perspective. I didn't do drag. I didn't do cocaine. I didn't do all the stuff that all the other gay people I know do. And my gay friends, whenever we've talked about this sort of thing, that this is just how gay life is for gay men. And it's funny because all we see are the images of, two happy dads with a brand new baby or a puppy getting married, and that world exists. But it's the only narrative that the LGBT world wants to focus on, is that is what gay life is, and that the only opposition are evil, hateful Christians that are trying to stigmatize it.
So can I ask, Chad, what would you say to my fellow Roman Catholics who, probably from good intentions and from the kindness of their hearts, believe that the Roman Catholic Church has not been kind enough to the LGBT community and that we have not been inviting enough? And they may be somewhat naive about the community that you're describing to me now, but they feel that something needs to be done to warm relations between us and our churches and our families and our children and the LGBT community. What would you say to them?
I would say the model that the Jewish community took is a positive one. It's not entirely negative to have an openness to people who are gay, who want to enjoy a faith. The danger, though, is when you try to accommodate secular or progressive ideas into your faith, to say, it's wrong to mention that homosexuality is considered a sin, for example, because that alone is enough to make gay people feel unwelcome. To me, the message should be more the way the Orthodox Jews handle it, which is, we understand that you're gay, but you still have an obligation to the faith. You can be a gay man or woman, and you can be Catholic. You can be a good Catholic.
With the understanding that you struggle with a sin, with a vice, or...
Yeah, exactly the same way as people struggle with other desires. In the Jewish world, we have a lot of restrictions, things that we're not allowed to do because it is Jewish law that we may want to do. And the idea is that our personal desires are less important than our obligation to the faith. That's a general belief in a lot of different religions. Our modern society has been consumed with the idea of absolute, immediate gratification of every desire that you have, and then if you're denied any desire, then you are being mortally wounded and oppressed. But there has to be a balance of, we want to encourage adults who are gay to partake in our faith, but we're not going to bend to the various liberal demands of things. I think transgenderism, in terms of children, has to be very carefully monitored. Adults can do whatever they want to their bodies, but the church, of all things, cannot encourage parents to allow their young children to cross-dress, essentially. And the issue of gay children is touchy. I was aware of my attraction to men about age 10, and I don't necessarily know what triggers that. I don't understand it in terms of biology or psychology. It's not ever been something that's been determined. But I was aware of it about age 10, and then it developed into a sexuality whenever I went through puberty. So the question is, how do you integrate them into normal society like all the other children who are also experiencing a rush of hormones and sexual desires? And that, to me, is what the challenge is for the Catholic Church, is bringing those kids into the fold with everyone else and helping them find a way to bring Catholicism into their life with the understanding of this one particular difficulty, and then they can make it a choice whenever they're an adult. But I feel like what you're describing is what we see in the rest of the secular world, which is not merely a tolerance or a we're not going to talk about it, but a proactive we're going to celebrate being gay. And I don't think that's positive for the Catholic Church. I don't think it's positive to try to create a religious lifestyle and then celebrate a sinful thing that is part of that faith. That makes no sense to me.
Right. Very well put. All right. Well, thank you. And I want to thank you again, Chad. I mean, what you're doing is really important work. I think you're literally saving young men, especially, from just so much heartbreak and pain. And I really am grateful to you for that.
I think my hope is that a 15-year-old would read my experience and recognize that it's not romanticized, just as people who are addicted to drugs want kids to see what it's actually like so that they don't romanticize it too because of what they see in media. There's nothing wrong with embracing who you are. If you are gay and you feel confident in that, there's no reason for that. But that doesn't mean that you stop being a teenager. Doesn't mean that you are suddenly adult, separated from your family, going out and engaging in risky behavior. You should date other people your own age, and you should take responsible choices with sex until you're an adult, and then hopefully mature into it is my hope.
Well, we've been talking with Chad Felix Greene. You can follow his work online at Chad Felix Greene with an E at the end of green.com. And you can also find him on Twitter at Chad Felix G. Again, at Chad Felix G. And I follow him on Twitter, and I recommend you do too. It was an honor having you, Chad. Become a Catholic as soon as possible. We could use you, and we'll have you on again soon.
All right, thanks.
Well, that's it for this week. You've been listening to the Catholic Vote Radio Hour, the show that makes Pope Francis say, man, I wish I'd thought of that first. I'm your host, Stephen Harriet. See you next week.